Good afternoon. So, we start a unit of CS 203, which actually goes on almost until the end, both political and moral theory. Politics, Hobbes, Locke. Moral, particularly Kant. Economics, Adam Smith, Marx. And Hobbes and Locke, whom you have after Hobbes, are really the foundation of political philosophy, also in a sense legal philosophy in Western Europe. You'll see the influence particularly of Locke on Adam Smith, labor theory of value, and therefore on Marx. If you read the extra reading of Rousseau, called A Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, he comes directly from both Hobbes and Locke, and his remarks on particularly Hobbes' state of nature are very interesting. I'll maybe mention it in the course of the lecture. So I'm going to, well, first of all, the fly sheet. The fly sheet has got the order of my lecture, and it contains all the quotations that I use in the course of the lecture, partly to familiarize yourself with the language of Hobbes, because Hobbes is writing in 1650, and his language, it's not as difficult as Shakespeare, but he uses grammar, and some of his words don't have the same meaning as they do these days. So it requires some attention on your part to get into his language. He wrote both in English and in Latin. We read his English version. Locke is similar. He wrote in English. Locke is a bit easier, I think, his English. So it's partly to familiarize yourselves with his language, but also because the way I see CS is that whatever interpretation one gives of somebody should come from what that somebody writes, not from secondary sources. CS is about primary sources. So we read Hobbes' own work in his own language. And so the evidence that we produce for any interpretation has to come from his own language. So that's why I use quite a lot of quotations in the course of my lecture. So now, with Hobbes, we come to almost the foundation of the secular state, the idea of the secular state in Europe, and to the first of what are called social contract theories of political order. The idea that order in a secular state is independent of religion and rests on a basic agreement between individuals, whereby part of everybody's natural rights or freedoms are given up, and a common authority is established to which everyone is subject. Historically, I'll give a bit of background. After the European Reformation of Christianity, which led to the division between Roman Catholicism and the different sects of Protestantism, there'd been a long period of civil wars in Europe over questions of religion. And theoretically, there was a crisis of political and moral order. Those of you who've done some political science will maybe have come across Machiavelli. Machiavelli, who we used to teach in 202, we used to read in 202, but no longer, unfortunately, do, wrote in about 1500, 1510. And his theory, which probably many of you will know, even if you don't associate it with Machiavelli, is to, as it were, divorce political from moral order. A prince could do anything to stay in power. He should appear to be good, but whether he was good or not, morally speaking, was out of the question. He would use whatever means he could in order to achieve the end of staying in power or getting in power. So that meant that morality was completely cut off from political order, from the idea of political order, unlike previous people. So, in a sense, there was a crisis where political theorists wanted to restore the relation between political order and moral order. And they did this by building, as it were, from the bottom up, from an idea of basic natural rights shared by everybody, all human beings. Hobbes and Locke both talk in the language of natural rights, a language that lies at the basis of most modern theories of the liberal state, human rights. The problem was what natural rights were universal. As you saw in the case of Descartes, less in the case of Bacon, thinkers of the period were aware of the great variety of beliefs and customs in the world, all held to be true by those who believed them. Was there anything in the world that was universally true? Descartes was so skeptical that he thought the only thing that he could be certain of, and he based his theory on that certainty, was the fact that as he was thinking, he was at least doing something, and so he existed. Yeah? Otherwise, what was to show that he wasn't dreaming? Hobbes, by contrast, didn't doubt the fact that he existed. There was an existent world. But what he doubted was that anybody could agree about their interpretation or the way they saw the world. In particular, what they thought was good and what was thought was bad. For everybody, according to Hobbes's opinion, had their own idea of good and evil. Every individual thought what was good was only good for him or her, not universally. So Hobbes and other philosophers of the period fixed on the idea of self-preservation as a basic natural right common to everybody. And they made that the foundation of their political philosophy. The right to preserve oneself led, through reasoning, to the realization in each person that he or she had to give up part of this right to a sovereign body responsible for the safety and security of everybody. This is what is called the social contract. The right to preserve oneself also led, in Hobbes's case, to a set of moral guidelines. But in Hobbes's case, these moral guidelines could only be held in place by somebody, a sovereign, a ruler, who had the absolute power over all his subjects. There wasn't, I'll go into this, but that's the central part of Hobbes's theory, that reason alone isn't sufficient to oblige one to follow reason. Reason can tell you, I've got to be peaceful, I've got to be honest, but it's not enough in Hobbes's theory to oblige one. You do ultimately what you want. So for Hobbes, you have to have a figure on top of you, holding you to your promises. In this, Hobbes and Locke use the concept of state of nature, in which there's no government, and everybody was free to exercise the one natural right of self-preservation. What kind of life would people lead? Nasty, brutish, and short was the very short answer that Hobbes had to this. In Hobbes's state of nature, the state of nature was a state of war of everybody against everybody. His conception of human nature was that ultimately everybody was going to fight everybody else. And it was this uncertainty, it was to avoid this natural state, Hobbes claimed, that people reckoned, reasoning, that they had to leave this state by agreeing with each other to give up part of their natural right and to set up a sovereign to rule over them. And in Hobbes's scheme, the sovereign, as I said, has to be absolute. The power of the sovereign has to be absolute. Once set up, there was no way in which you could get rid of the sovereign, not like periodic elections or... You're familiar with such absolute power in the present world, unfortunately. Locke is different. Locke allows the possibility because Locke has the idea that sovereignty ultimately rests in the people, and sovereignty is a matter of trust between yourself and the sovereign. And if the sovereign goes beyond the trust that you give in him or her or it, then you, as ultimately the sovereign, can pull power back. So there's an idea that civil resistance is legitimate. But in Hobbes's case, there's not that. Once you decide to set up a sovereign, then the sovereign is there. And nothing he does can, you can't do anything about it. I'll go through the argument in detail a little bit later. But first of all, I want to make the parallel, draw the parallel between the state of nature amongst individuals and the state of nature between nations, i.e. internationally. Hobbes And this is where we get into a little bit of contrast, not only with Locke, but also with Rousseau. Hobbes makes clear that the state of nature amongst individuals need never have existed. Both he and Locke, something to do with the period, use America as a concept where perhaps there is no government, because they'd got reports from the last previous 150 years about Indians, American Indians, who seemed to have no leader. And this worried them because what happens when you don't have an obvious leader? So, in Hobbes's case, he says that the state of nature may never have existed. His is a kind of theoretical idea, deductive. And he says that nevertheless you can imagine the state of nature amongst individuals by seeing what happens when civil war breaks out and people no longer accept sovereignty of a government, and they break out into anarchy of war against everybody. So you can imagine it by imagining the worst evil of everything, which is civil war. Hobbes is writing at the time of a little bit after the completion of the only civil war that occurred in English history. He wrote in 1651, and the king had been executed, had been killed by the people, by the parliament, and parliament had come into power. And for him, the worst evil, the death of what he calls civil society, the Commonwealth, Leviathan, is civil war. So the state of nature can be imagined by seeing what happens when breakdown of political order happens in a civil war. But the state of nature can also be seen internationally, because at that time, we're talking of the beginning of the period of the development of nation-states in Europe. 1650 is when nation-states are beginning to compete with each other to develop the economy and to expand all across the globe. This started, of course, with the so-called discovery of America, when Portugal thought that it was going in search of spices in the east. And Portugal then, particularly Portugal initially, went round the Cape of Good Hope, Africa, to the east and developed ports all over the east. And then that was followed. The Spaniards went to America, Portuguese went to America, followed by the Dutch, followed by the English, and there was terrific competition, as I'm sure you know. But so you have to put that into historical context. So as far as the international arena was concerned, every nation was essentially, as he says, in a state of war against each other. So you can imagine the state of nature from the international scene, not so much from the way that actual people exist in relation to each other. So Hobbes says, kings and persons of sovereign authority are in continual jealousies with each other in a posture of war. So, in other words, nations are in a state of nature amongst themselves, since there's no international law-making body to which each nation is subject. Again, you have to go back to the period 1650, the development of nation-states, when there's no international law. Yeah? There's no body like the UN. You can be cynical about the UN and about international law. You've got an example in Lebanon of the tribunal, which is examining the assassination of Hariri. But to say that that tribunal is not subject to influence, political influence, is to have faith in a body that you can doubt, yeah? And international law as well. I mean, one doesn't need to really, but the examples at present, both in Syria and in Yemen, are just terrible. The state can do what it likes. Yeah? Anyway, yeah. So in 1650, there wasn't even the idea of international law. Now, at least, there is the idea of international law and the idea that people and governments can be brought up before the court of international law and accused of crimes against humanity. But in 1650, not. So I guess there's been some development. A related idea to this is the idea of preemption. War had been justified historically if it was always a case of self-defense. But what you didn't have always, and this came back during this period of the development of European nation-states, was the idea of preemptive war. That is to say that in order to prevent some possible danger, you attack your enemy without his or before the enemy attacking you. And Hobbes brings this into his idea of natural right, because according to him, your natural right extends to every other's body. Your natural right to things extends to people. If you want something and somebody is in your way, then never mind. Yeah? This is quite different from Locke. Locke similarly uses a sense of the concept state of nature. But in his idea, the state of nature is a benign state. And the reason for that, i.e., people are not at war always. They have reason to use. But above all, Locke says that the natural right to preserve yourself, the same as Hobbes, with Locke, it extends to the duty to preserve every other member of your species, because all of the human species are the property of God. They're all one. And so to preserve yourself, if you see an attack being made on your fellow being, your duty is to preserve that fellow being. Whereas in Hobbes' case, absolutely not. Yeah. Just to finish off that brief comparison with Locke, where somebody departs from the rule of reason and takes on the rule of force in the state of nature according to Locke, that person departs from the moral sense of being human. And so human beings can treat that person who has taken on force, not reason, like a beast. So that's looking forward to Locke. But in Hobbes's case, mine and thine, the difference between mine and yours doesn't exist in the state of nature. Human nature basically is egotistical, looks just at its passions. Since I've started on comparison, I'll add the comparison with Rousseau, because his comment is very interesting. He comes, of course, a century after Hobbes, 1750, not 1650. And he uses the idea of the state of nature. But as I said earlier, Hobbes's idea of the state of nature is not really empirical, whereas Rousseau's state of nature is even pre-social. He imagines, and that's why, according to him, the human beings are basically nice. They're not evil. Because before you develop language, all you care about, before you have family relations, before you get into contact with other human beings and make a society, your life is quite simple. You don't need anything at all. It's only when you start to develop society that problems of comparison between yourself and other people come in. He gives the image of a kind of village dance, or dabke, and in which you look at people who are dancing and you say, that person is a good dancer. And you start to get jealous. And so he comes from this idea of comparison to develop his idea of the development of inequality. So anyway, these are two comparisons: Hobbes with Locke and Hobbes with Rousseau. Rousseau is interesting also because when it comes to social being, Rousseau rather agrees with Hobbes that it's when you start comparing with each other that questions of power come in, and questions of absence of power. So with Hobbes's theory, because in the state of nature everybody is on his own, Hobbes's theory develops into a theory of power. And power means a little bit more than somebody else. Okay, so now I'm going to go over some of the details of Hobbes's scheme of things. I first of all want to discuss his method, because it's the method of Descartes and the method of Bacon that you were reading earlier. Hobbes claims to lay the basis of political philosophy as a science. But what does he mean by science? He means building up a theory by deduction from hypotheses about the causes of events, not systematic experimentation in the manner that you saw in the case of Bacon. Although Hobbes, for a period, was the secretary of Bacon, so you would expect him to be experimental, but he's not. No. Hobbes is deductive. He says that you don't go out to nature to seek your hypothesis. You look at yourself through introspection. Now, his theory, how does he build up his theory? His theory starts off with a mechanical account. He's a materialist. Everything in the universe is matter, including spirit. Yeah? Hobbes, so he starts off with a mechanical account of the universe as bodies in motion. Man, too, is mechanical, like a clock. You saw the image of the clock in Descartes' Discourse 5, yeah? That as far as body is concerned, the universe works according to laws. Yeah? It's only the body is not the same as spirit. Spirit, according to Descartes, has to be expressly created by God. It doesn't obey the same laws. Yeah? So with Descartes, you have a complete distinction between science on the one hand, obeying laws, and religion on the other. He saves religion. But with Hobbes, no, everything is matter. Bodies in motion. So your thoughts, your sensations are the result of bodies hitting your senses and your senses conveying to the brain. Yeah? There's no special thing called reason. Reason, according to Hobbes, is a product of labor, of hard work. You have instinctively memory, sensation, yeah? But so you have some things called thoughts, yeah? But what you then have is the ability to add one thought to another, or subtract one thought from another, in order to get some deduction out of it. And that's what he calls reasoning. It's not that reason is a special faculty. Yeah? So he uses the term reasoning, but not in the sense of Descartes, that reason is a special faculty. And what he calls science is the kind of adding together of the consequences drawn from adding and subtracting thoughts. Okay. So, man's animal motion starts with what Hobbes calls endeavour and drives him to desire things or turn away from them. Whatever he desires, he calls good, and whatever he turns away from, he calls evil. The sense or appearance of the motion of desire gives man pleasure or joy. That of aversion, i.e., moving away from something, pain or grief. In the state of nature, there's thus complete moral relativity. There's no absolute at all. Everybody says that I want something means that's good for me, not for anybody else. This is when man is imagined on his own. But when man is imagined in company, something else occurs. This is where power comes in. Because no two people see the same object in the same way, there's a basic lack of trust between one individual and the next. And it's because of this lack of trust, ultimately, that a supreme body has to be established over everyone, with the power to keep everybody to their word. Man in company is thus caught in a predicament. He's always comparing himself with others. Quotes, "For if everything were equally in all men, nothing would be prized. Man is forever in motion, forever seeking happiness, which he defines as a continual progress of the desire from one object to another. One can no more cease to desire than cease to live." Quotes, "A general inclination of all mankind is therefore, according to Hobbes, a perpetual and restless desire of power after power that ceaseth only in death. With man in company with other men, therefore, Hobbes' political theory inevitably becomes a theory of power. And power is eminence, being ahead of others in natural ability or in the race to riches, reputation, friends, as means to acquire more. Man in company with other men, without an overall restraining power to keep everyone in check, is what Hobbes calls the state of nature. I think I've talked enough about that. The inevitable result of this ceaseless desire of power after power is that, quotes, "During the time that men live together without a common power to keep them all in awe, they are in that condition which is called war. And such a war as is of every man against every man." I'm just giving the quotation now for what I've said already. "In such a condition," he says, "there is no place for industry, because the fruit thereof, the fruit of industry, is uncertain, and consequently no arts, no letters, no society, and, which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short." Hobbes has built up his theory of why men need political order from a theory of matter, bodies in motion, people in motion, to man on his own, man in company, and man in civil society. The inevitable result of this, we're not going very fast, are we? The inevitable result of this ceaseless power after power is that, state of nature is a state of war. So what do you do to get out of that? Everybody uses the sense that they've got and uses the ability to add or subtract thoughts to scout around for means to get out of this state. And now we have what becomes the link between moral order and political order. Man, everybody in this audience, in this room, scouts around individually to say, what do I need to do to get out of this state of war, the state of nature? And so the first thing that everybody says to themselves is, I've got to seek peace, not war. Everybody individually is going to say that as a fundamental hypothesis. If I'm going to get out of this, I've got to seek peace. Number two, that's not going to lead anywhere. Yeah? Number two, everybody is going to say, well, I may have to give up some of my natural right to everything, which includes everybody's body. Yeah? Every other body I've got to do something to get out of this situation, so I may have to give up something, provided others do as well. I can't do it on my own, because if I give up something, according to Hobbes, you only give up something for some benefit. You only do something for some benefit. So, provided others do too. And this is a problem, because in the state of nature, there is no trust. So if you do something, how on earth are you to ensure that other people are going to do the same? There's nothing. Yeah? So along comes your reasoning power, and it says, well, in that case, I've got to have a third hypothesis. And that third hypothesis, the first one is seek peace, the second is I may have to give up something of my natural right. The third is to say, I've got to keep my promises. And so you have these first three, what he calls laws of nature. They're not laws, they're, as it were, precepts, what he calls precepts of reason, yeah? i.e., as it were, hypotheses that everybody tells himself or herself that they've got to do these things in order to get out of the state of nature. Yeah? But the problem is lack of trust. So how do you get over that? You have to set up a sovereign who actually will make you keep those laws of nature. And once you do that, then these precepts of reason actually do become laws of nature to which everybody will agree. Yeah? There are not 3 of them, there are 20. And some of them are a little bit odd, but worth thinking about. I mean, chapter 14, where these, of the Leviathan, where these are expounded, are worth reading. The law of nature, the 12th and 13th law of nature, for instance, says something about common property. That is to say, the law of the sea, or the law of the air, or the law of water, which is shared by everybody. And these days, unfortunately, not just here, but everywhere, such common property is thought to be open game for privatization. Yeah? So Hobbes has some interesting things to say about what should be universal. So once you get the idea that that you have to have somebody with a sword in his hand to make you keep your promises, to make you keep that third law of reason, precept of reason, then how much power does he have? He has to have absolute power. That power can't be divided. It can't be given out. It can't be resolved. Why? Because you have given him authority, or her authority, or it authority. And so you are the author of whatever that sovereign does, in a sense. It's different from Locke's sense of trust. Yeah? Locke retains the sovereignty in the individual and says, I give my power on condition that the sovereign does something. But in Hobbes, you are the author of whatever the sovereign does. You've given up your right. Yeah? So, where do we go from there? We go to absolute power, but we also go to a little bit of a contradiction. Yeah? In two things, and with these two things I'm going to finish. The first is the idea of the Leviathan, i.e. of society, as being the most important thing for the security of each individual. The picture of the Leviathan that Hobbes had on the front of his book is of a man composed of many, many individuals. So you have individual bodies forming the body of the society. And the body of the society, as I said earlier, dies when civil war breaks down. And you have the image of the body of society with all sorts of different functions, heart, lungs, nerves, and so on, in order to give the body life. And so these go into different institutions of the state. So now there's something that you should discuss in class, which is what if the sovereign has power, absolute power? What is a good law? That a sovereign has the power to make any law, but what's a good law? A good law must be for the sake of the sovereign body, in order for the sovereign body to have life, society to have life. So does that mean a good law is good for the sovereign? No. In fact, Hobbes says no. For the life of a sovereign and the life of the people are bound up together. So that's the first question. What is a good law? In Hobbes' scheme, despite his absolutism. And the second question is, how much freedom actually do you have in Hobbes' state of absolute power? Yeah? And here you go back to the idea of self-preservation, as well as the idea that you are the author of anything that the sovereign, any order that the sovereign gives. According to your self-preservation, you do not have the right to kill yourself. Yeah? So, if the sovereign who is acting on your authority from you as author tries to kill you, you have the right to resist. Yeah? Because ultimately that would mean killing yourself. So, Hobbes says, in the case of conscription to the army, yeah, if you can find somebody else in your place to take your place to join the army, do so, because you can avoid the problem of killing yourself, the danger of being killed. So if you've got that freedom to decide, if somebody is coming towards you, you don't know what they're going to do. Are they going to kill you? Are they going to... You don't know. Yeah? How much freedom do you have? So that's the second question I want to raise in this idea of absolute power. I haven't covered anything like the whole content of my flight sheet, but thank you for your attention.